we'll try to finish this packet today, but if we don't, it'll be all right. So we're on fact number 3. There is a new handout for fact number 4 on the back table, so make sure that you get that and be prepared to start that on Wednesday. All right, so what we are looking at in this fact, looking at the universal sort of truths that anybody really can and should believe, whether they believe in Jesus or not. Do you remember what 2 things primarily we're looking at in examining the sincere belief of the disciples? We're really kind of looking at 2 things. They're the big bolded headings on pages, one of which is on page 4. What 2 sort of lines of evidence are we looking at to establish their belief?
What did they do and what did they say?
Yeah, what did they say and what did they do? So that's what we've been looking at. Because it is, as we said, it's sort of a truth that everyone agrees on, that the disciples sincerely believed that they saw Jesus alive again. They really, truly believe that. And in showing just how certain it is, we said, okay, what did they say and what did they do? Well, they claimed to see Jesus alive again in the resurrection appearances. And so we walked through those appearances as Paul laid them out. And then we said, okay, what did they do? If they said all that stuff and they didn't change their lives, we said that would probably arise some questions if they just returned to business as usual. But their lives were changed. And so we started looking at what did they do? Would there be any reason to make that up in terms of their faults and foibles, all of that? And then the ultimate, we started looking at their suffering and their martyrdom. And so we left off with James, the brother of Jesus, on Wednesday, in looking at what, for instance, Josephus said about his martyrdom. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking about this a couple days ago. The fact, what they say and what they do. Mm-hmm. The longevity of what they did.
Yeah.
Is a big statement to their belief too. Because how many times in life do we make a quick change and change something, and then we just slowly revert back?
Yep.
Whether it's exercise, dieting, whether it's a reading habit, whether it's a hobby, we always just it just fizzles out and we wander back. And that's kind of human nature, but that's not what we see. I mean, we see that, they made this instant change, and even through, persecution in time, it stayed, as prevalent in their lives.
Yeah, if not getting more serious, really. Yeah, that's right. I make resolutions and changes all the time, and I'm horrible at establishing new habits and things. But that's not what they did here. They changed their lives for the rest of their lives. And so we looked at James as an example of that this was the brother of Jesus. And we talked about, this question on the bottom of page 5. What would it take for you to die for the belief that your brother is the Lord, as James did? And just what that testifies as to the sincere belief of these people. And so then we're going to start on the top of page 6. We're looking at all this, but is there the possibility that they were just making it up for some reason? Do we have any questions that we want to ask or things that we want to comment on before we start this section here? Okay. So we're going to look at this. Are they just making it up? So obviously there's multiple explanations that we can have for the disciples, and their leader is killed, and so then somebody could say, well, then they just tried to, I think as someone said last time, try to save face and claim, well, he's actually still alive. But looking at number 1, I'm interested in what you all think. Number 1 on the top of page 6. Do you think there's any possibility that the apostles made up the resurrection story to obtain, for instance, some kind of fame or fortune? Chip.
They didn't succeed.
That's true, yeah.
They didn't get fame or fortune.
We'll look at that in a minute. Chip, what were you going to say?
I was going to say that I could see someone claiming that they made it up because they were already outcast because of the Jewish community, but then that also wouldn't make absolute sense because there would be also jobs that would be available because of the Roman Empire. So you'll have two possible occupations that you could, I guess, do at the, or two, you know what I mean? If you're shunned by the Jewish community, then you would still be able to, get a job with like some kind of a Roman like farm work or things like that because they obviously needed those positions still at the time.
Okay, yeah, so what Chip is saying is, because of their claim of who Jesus was, they are essentially kicked out of Jewish society, which is usually the case. Well, and maybe they could have just assimilated into the Greco-Roman society. Maybe they could have, but they did not do that. They actually caused more and more problems for themselves. For one, as we talked about with some of the objections that were raised on Wednesday, in claiming that Jesus was Lord and Messiah, they made themselves an enemy to the Romans, and they did not stop that. Did I see another hand? Grace, did you have your hand up or no?
I did, and I had a note that the only fame they gained would have been much later, and they would have never had any idea that they would have gained the fame. What
I mean,
mean
really
by
after
that
they
is
were dead, yeah.
They are celebrated today in ways that they would be very uncomfortable with
Yeah.
in some circles and groups, but they could have had no idea that that would have been the outcome. And that notoriety came at significantly later time.
Right, really after they were dead. And so kind of my response to this question of if there's any possibility to obtain some kind of fame or fortune, I said, what fame or fortune? That's a pretty common objection, but if you examine that, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. They lost everything, and then they continued to lose everything and to risk everything because they wouldn't stop what they were doing. So remember, for instance, I keep coming back to these sources because they essentially lay out everything in our class, and you're familiar with them. Josephus and Tacitus, what they said, Jesus was killed, but his followers did not stop. They kept on going. And in that, they ruined their lives in doing that from a worldly perspective. So there was not really anything that they gained, at least while they were alive. Maybe you could say, well, they became leaders within this community. But even then, you look at Paul's writings, and just being an apostle did not guarantee that people were going to listen to you or that they were going to regard you as important. There was that kind of competition from the beginning. So really, what fame or fortune are we talking about? Race, did you have your hand up again? And then
I was just going to say, it's not really an answer, but it's like if it is a hoax, it is really well done, and it has been extremely effective.
Yeah.
It doesn't have the hallmarks that we would typically expect from a hoax. And when skeptics look at something with the kind of scrutiny that typically they do, generally they'll find some holes that say, look, this is clear evidence that this was a fabrication, that they were just working together very closely to try to pull this thing off, and there are none of those.
Right, yeah, and we're going to look at a lot of those objections in detail later. But right, this has been, people have tried to disprove this for 2,000 years, and especially about the last 250. And these facts that we're talking about, as someone said, came through the fires of all of that and are still confirmed by everyone. I had Addie and then Andrew.
I just had that it wasn't what Jesus promised to them, and even just like their connection with them, and when he had sent them out, he said in Matthew 10, 22, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next, for truly I say to you, you will not have gone
Yeah. And I wonder, again, we see that he said things very explicitly that they didn't always grasp. And I wonder how much they really latched onto that. That Jesus promised them, if you continue in serving me, you're going to be hated and you're going to suffer. And ultimately, some of you are going to die for this. And I assume that that probably clicked at some point later. Andrew?
So, if I wanted to argue that they were making it up, one thing I would say is, well, why wouldn't they have baked in their humility into the story to make them a more sympathetic messenger? The account of Peter after he heals and after they perform miracles being worshipped as gods and them saying, no, 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 we are men, and refusing that worship. It elevates and makes the messenger more sympathetic to see, oh, look, they had the opportunity to receive and bask in the worship and they refused it. Look how good they were. And so if I were arguing that they were making the story up, they weren't stupid, and I would say, why wouldn't they have done this to build their credibility with the people that they were targeting with the message?
Yeah, absolutely, because they displace that credibility and say it's not, we're witnesses to it, but it's not about us. It's about him. And so in that way, they have all of this that they could have had in their hands, and they say, no, I don't want that, and put it on Jesus.
I'm not sure you're getting the point I was making, because I'm saying if they were faking the message, they would
Oh,
say
that they would say that?
wouldn't this be what you would expect to see if they wanted you to believe that they rejected the faith?
Yeah. So what would you say to that?
I don't know. I like throwing out these
Devil's advocate.
what ifs and then thinking about it later. I haven't thought through that yet.
Well, and as you guys know, I'm not great on the spot, so I have to think about things.
That's open to anybody. I'm not just
Yeah.
asking you.
Does anybody have something they want to say as I'm processing?
Would be very unusual. I mean, there have been hoaxes that have followed since the events of the resurrection of Jesus that have employed some of those tactics. But again, it's very unusual because even in situations where leaders tend to play somewhat the humility card, the ultimate goal and aim is to be recognized. And everything about these men seems that they are shunning that they are casting that off. And if what they wanted was to be recognized as humble servants and get nothing out of this, then they got it. But that would be very odd. Most people are will pull these kinds of things for some benefit, ultimately for themselves.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, there's no apparent benefit that they gain from any of it. In fact, Paul makes that argument pretty clearly. If I'm preaching Christ to be recognized and powerful and great, then, wow, that kind of backfired on me. It's not working out so well.
I had a couple walkers, and I don't know which ones. Greg?
Conspiracists are one characteristic of people. The people who enjoy following conspiracists and believing them against maybe conflicting evidence are a different makeup of people. Some people like to they feel like they've got knowledge, special revelation
Kayla, did you have anything?
Ray
Ray summarized it? Okay, yeah, I think, with that, as people were saying, objections like that, it's easy to make those kind of claims, but then when we look at the evidence of what actually happened, it just does not fit that. It would be a really backwards way, and I guess it would be, there would be a lot to prove there for one, but then also, as I see with conspiracy theories and different things, it has a really high view of what people are able to collude on and come up with, and just, it makes them just masterminds that I don't think most of us actually are, especially, Jewish peasants in a way. Of course, there's no end to these that we could come up with. Did anybody want to add to that, or Andrew, did you want to tack on at that?
Yeah, I think Bryce's comment helped me too, and I think the way I would frame it is, just consider matching up their lifestyle with their proclaimed humility, and you see that, their life didn't yield them any benefits that
Yeah.
false humility would. You look at the televangelist who lives in a mansion and buys a jet and all these things and preaches to their congregation humility and piety, and then you see their lifestyle completely doesn't match what living out that humility would show. And with the apostles and disciples who are preaching, Paul says it, we're homeless. We roam from city to city, and we don't have the money to feed ourselves unless, people help and step in and feed us. And when we have to, we'll mend some tents to make some money and buy our food. And so, the lifestyle they led, which I think can be matched from sources outside of their own writings as well, the mentions of their lives in the other people's writings, shows that, if this was a false humility to try to, because I think human nature can't resist building ourselves up if we do have false motives. If we're falsely projecting humility, our nature almost can't resist, well, I'm going to make myself grander in the process, or I'm going to gain something from this. And if that was their aim, they found a backdoor way to actually live out the humility that they were faking, if that's the case, because you don't see any kind of that benefit coming from their, quote, false humility.
Yeah, and I think this goes right into the next thing that I want to talk about here on page 6. And it said, consider what Paul says is the real prize that they got of those holding to this conviction as witnesses of the resurrection. So this is 1 Corinthians 4, and you can turn there, or we can look at it on the screen. But 1 Corinthians 4, 9 through 13 is sort of one of the famous passages where Paul is summarizing, the lot of the apostles. And so this is what those who claim to have seen the risen Jesus actually received in terms of a prize or fame or fortune or whatever. Can I get a volunteer to read 1 Corinthians 4, 9 through 13? Jeff?
This is from NIV. For it seems to me that God has put us apostles on display at the end of the procession, like men condemned to die in the arena. We have been made spectacle to the whole universe, to angels as well as to men. We are fools for Christ, but you are so wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are honored, we are dishonored. To this very hour we go hungry and thirsty. We are in rags, we are brutally treated. We are homeless. We work hard with our hands. When we are cursed, we bless. When we are persecuted, we endure. When we are slandered, we answer kindly. Up to this moment, we have become the scum of the earth, the refuge of the world.
Yeah, that's a really choice thing to do, if we're wanting to gain something. So what this proves, again, as we talked about last time, it doesn't prove that what they were claiming was true. It proves that they were sincere in what they were claiming. And their lives demonstrate that they were not intentionally making anything up. Maybe they were deceived. We'll talk about that later. But they were not intentionally making anything up, and their lives are sort of an evidence to that. And so there's not really, incentives to continuing this way of life in terms of the suffering and the death and what they were going to lose. So let's look at number 2 under this making it up. What were the early disciples risking by sticking to their testimony? Margaret? Yeah, ultimately their lives. Yeah, their lives and their livelihood. So obviously we understand, yeah, that a lot of them died. And most of them were established tradesmen and things of that, and they literally dropped it and left it, it seems like, for the rest of their lives. And so livelihood is another one.
I mean, they were also risking by spreading this message so far and so wide, they were risking running into someone who knew that this was a lie and coming forward with proof that it was a lie. And so, I mean, they risked being proved liars if it was made up.
Yeah, and that's a big thing too. They didn't say, okay, let's pick up and all move to Rome, and then we'll say all of these things happened in Jerusalem. They stayed in Jerusalem and made these claims around all of the people who experienced everything that happened. And that very easily could have, yielded to somebody saying, what are you talking about? Jesus' body is over here. You guys are nuts. But they were in that same environment making these claims when right there was people around who could say that's not true. That's not what happened.
Chip already pointed this out with the loss of their community,
Yeah.
which is really a very harmful and devastating thing to people.
Which in the New Testament is usually framed in the phrase, kicked out of the synagogue. And we don't really understand that. So if you think about maybe some of us understand, if your family and your religion and sometimes your livelihood were all wrapped up into one, and being removed from that community meant losing all of those, that is kind of the idea. You would be cut off from, obviously, family and friends. You'd be cut off from the people of God, religiously speaking, all of the social programs that the Jewish people had. Because if you lose your job, they would a lot of times take care of people. But if you're kicked out of the synagogue, you're a pariah and you don't have access to all that. So up in all of that, there's the dishonor and the shame and the losing of family. And we've talked about careers and expulsion from the community, and then obviously the death as well. Aaron.
And it's interesting to think from the standpoint is they're inviting others to join their, we'll call it a movement, because that's what it was at the time, their movement. And so just the pressure from just society, because can you imagine, you're a family, a Jewish family, and you're not convinced of this, but one person in your family becomes convinced of this and joins them. Just the strife among your family and the animosity you would have towards these guys. I can just imagine, groups and groups in these communities are so outraged because they don't believe the same thing that these guys are teaching.
Yeah.
So just the public disdain for them would, I would assume, would be high.
And Jesus said that would happen too. Mother against daughter-in-law, and father against son, and brother and sister against each other. That was going to be the outcome. And basically, they were going to lose everything. Jeff?
From their life after the resurrection, it seems like they internalized the message. And I think there's a belief between believing, or there's something between believing and internalizing.
Yeah.
How can we go from belief to internalizing?
Yeah. In some of my schooling, the phrasing is knowledge of versus knowledge that. I can have knowledge of something, but knowledge that it is actually the case is a totally different thing. And yet they change themselves based on this message.
Well, and you can see that. I mean, this is a weak comparison, but I understand the knowledge of the Civil War and all that. But there are people that internalize that. They go to festivals and reenactment and creation. It's part of who they are, because there is a difference between I know this and it's so internal in me that I want to be part of and take part in that. I mean, I could get invited 700 Civil War reenactment, and I would say no every time. I have no interest in
You
that.
think about this a lot?
Not really, but it's not something I would be interested in. Or any of the reenactment stuff. It's not part of who I am. But there are people that is such a big part of them. As you see that, and I appreciate Jeff's point that you can see the shift in the disciples is, this got so rooted inside of them that, just like they say, we can't stop doing this.
Right. And I think as we talked about I think it was the previous page, I think Peter is one of the best examples of that. As we pointed out, he's hiding from everyone when Jesus is on trial. And then months later, he's standing in front of the exact people that condemned Jesus to death and said, "You cannot make me stop." And there wasn't fame or fortune in that, obviously. He knew that they could have put him in prison, or they could have had him executed as a blasphemer like they did with Jesus. So Peter is an example of sort of what we're talking about. Greg?
Going back to 1 Corinthians 4, where Paul says, I'm not telling you all these things that we're battered and bruised and beat up and all this to shame you, but it's to encourage you to be like me. And well, that's a great message.
Yeah, thanks.
That really draws the followers just like flies to honey. But then he goes on to say, we've taught Christ everywhere. You're pushing back against my apostleship. I'll take that. That's fine. That's on me. But he says then in verse 20, towards the conclusion, and this is a conclusion statement: for the kingdom of God does not consist in words, but in power. And I think this goes to what we've been talking about in internalizing. Now, they did have special extra earthly abilities because of the Spirit. I don't think that's what he's referring to here. I think he's referring to this, that the belief is such a grasp on your heart. It's such a powerful thing to be a child of God that transcends all this stuff that's going on around us. I think that's what he's referring to. I can't say that he's not talking about or he's not thinking of, well, not only are we speaking in your presence and telling you these things and sharing you with what we saw, and this is how we act because of what we saw. I think he's saying, once you get it, once you, as Jeff used the phrase, internalize it, once you really hang on to it, you see that this is irresistible, and it goes to why they suffered all the things that they suffered. It goes to why that they would encourage others to emulate their behavior, knowing how rough they had it, not to, again, draw attention to their plight, but to draw attention to the fact that this is a life-changing, powerful foundation for living.
Yeah. There are eternal implications to this. Absolutely.
The question, I think, is for us to ask ourselves, are we at the belief? Do we just believe it? Or are we where we've internalized it, where we're dedicated and devoted and relentless about it?
Absolutely. And that's part of why, I asked these questions in the reflection. And so I hope we can get to this a little bit more. I want to move on here. So we've talked about what they said. Oh, sorry, Andrew.
Can we
Go
not
ahead.
move on?
Sure, go ahead.
Sorry.
Just for you.
I just had an example to Jeff's question that really clicked in my head. So I studied piano as a kid, and our teacher would make us memorize pieces. And there's pieces of music that I've memorized so deeply, I can't think about how to start it, but when I sit down and touch a keyboard, it works. And my brain isn't doing it, it's my body doing it. So that's internalized. But when I started out, I can't listen to the music, and no matter how many, I could listen to a song 1,000 times and still not know how to play it. I have to move my body, put my hands to the keys, and move my fingers, and do that over and over until I can move my fingers without my brain even thinking about it. And to me, that's internalizing, is you can hear the message all day, you can talk about it like Dad mentioned in Corinthians 4:20, the idle talk, 1,000 times over you can talk about it, but until you move your body and take action, and that act of doing something what starts to make it permanent. And the first few times you do it and you actually take the action, you wouldn't really have the feeling like, this doesn't feel natural, this doesn't feel like I'm really doing it right. You may even doubt it and push past that, do the actions anyway, and in time, the feelings follow the actions.
Yeah, okay. I cannot connect with that. I don't have that experience, but yeah, I know what you're talking about. Chip, did you have your hand up?
Yeah. I was gonna say that, during maybe a few years into Jesus' ministry, the apostles, whenever Jesus was talking with the Samaritan woman, they were like, "Why is he talking and wasting his time with this Samaritan?" Right? So we see that they had very, kind of not racist maybe, but Jewish, like we only want to go to the Jews, and then 14 years later, they're going to Samaria, they're going to what we have on the screens, Corinth, where they would say these people are degenerates. We don't want anything to do with these people.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that message takes them even further and bigger. We do need to move on, unless these are just absolutely earth-shattering things we have to say. I'm glad about all this, but we have a schedule.
I'll be real
Okay.
quick. Conversely, what Andrew talks about is that something internalizes, yes. But you can also lose that.
Yeah.
And you can lose your ability, not your ability, but your desire to preach, to teach other people the gospel, to share the gospel, if you don't continue that. There are certain things that are just set. There's a certain chord that you can put your hands down and automatically that's going to play. But if you don't keep on doing that,
If you don't use it, you lose it.
exactly.
I don't know where that comes from, but I've heard it. Okay, and Joy is the absolute last person on this topic.
It's because you're teaching such a good class. I was really impressed with, there's these theories that are true, but for some reason, they saw fit to put individually all this description.
Yeah.
And just generally say, it was rough for them. No, he specifically lists every single one of those. And then, like Craig said, to be able to try and convince somebody else to join us in all this list of things. And then as far as we're concerned, it was very helpful to me to look at those things and say, could I have done that? Each one of those on that list, could I have done, can I do that today? And if not, have I internalized it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that you guys took that and expanded it. So I'm not trying to move on, but I'm trying to move on. I'm sorry. So we looked at what did they say, what did they do, then where did this come from? It's just this literally world-changing claim and manner of life that they did. Where did this come from? And so there's different ways that this could be explained. And so right under that I put what Paul explains happened in all of this in terms of these claims that he appeared to so on and so on and so on, and what this means later in 1 Corinthians 15. It was that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. And we read that and we're like, oh yeah, all of Scripture talks about the fact that the Messiah was going to come and he was going to suffer and he was going to be raised from the dead, and then all of these spiritual things were going to happen, and we take that for granted because they did not see it that way when it was happening. This was a complete innovation that no one else had talked about before. So I want to make sure to discuss this at the bottom of here of page 6. And I'm trying to summarize things that there are just books and books and books written on, just establishing the fact of it does not make sense from their worldview how they could have made this up. And so I just want to read some of this because of the fact that I tried to painstakingly explain it. But just these paragraphs here on the bottom of page 6. The message of Jesus' resurrection was totally unique. We don't always think of it that way. But the disciples of Jesus claimed a positive interpretation of his crucifixion, which had never happened before. No one had ever put a positive spin on crucifixion. And that he had individually been raised from the dead, crowned as God's chosen, and that he was God's divine son. No one in the Jewish or Greco-Roman world was thinking anything like this that could explain where the disciples of Jesus could have made up these ideas. The main reason is that a crucified and resurrected Messiah was completely unfounded in Jewish thought. No one thought that that could happen. And so that's trying to summarize this idea. That if you look at what Jews had thought up to that point and in that time, no one was thinking that this was a possibility. There is no way that we can explain that, oh, they took some ideas that were sort of floating around at the time and they changed them a little bit. So I want to say some things and then we'll read that quote just to show that I'm not just making this up. This is kind of a consensus. So to the Jewish people at the time, they believed in the resurrection. But what the Jewish people thought from the Old Testament scriptures at that time is there was a general resurrection of all believers at the end of time. And that was the only thing that was going to happen. And so then these Jewish men say, oh, there was actually this man who you all just witnessed as crucified. God raised him from the dead, and he is the first fruits of that resurrection. It didn't make any sense. Where were they getting this from? And it's important to understand that for the Jews, they saw this as a reanimation, a bodily resurrection. This was not just some sort of like spiritual thing. They thought at the end of time that bodies would be raised from the dead and glorified. But there was no room for the Messiah is going to be raised from the dead, and he's going to do all of these things. There was no room for the fact that the Messiah was going to be killed, because he was supposed to be the warrior king that was going to come and reestablish the kingdom of Israel. And there's also some indication that they thought maybe that there was a priestly Messiah figure and that there was two different ones, but definitely not someone who's going to wrap this all up into one and then die and be raised from the dead. And I don't know if I can explain just how important this distinction is, that there is nowhere that they could have just made this up from in terms of their contemporary beliefs. There was this hope, but it was a hope for all of God's people at the end of time, not exemplified in one person. And an important thing to note, they did not say that God had spiritually raised Jesus from the dead and now he's reigning in heaven. That would have been easy. Oh, you killed him, but Jesus is actually in heaven with God and he's reigning, even though you can't see that or we can't prove that. What they said was, God bodily raised him from the dead and we saw it. And there's a huge distinction there. This was not just some kind of spiritual reality that no one could touch or feel or corroborate. They said that he was bodily raised from the dead and that they witnessed it. We cannot explain this belief from anything that the Jews or the Romans were saying at the time. There's just not any information there. Brace.
The other thing to think about with regard to this particular point is the concept of God becoming a man or walking among men would have been pagan at best. No
Yeah.
Jew would have ever dreamt of making something like that up. It would have just been too far-fetched and too far out there for anybody to consider unless there was some kind of evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. You really have to understand their context to just see how far-fetched and unbelievable this claim was. That nobody could have seen this coming. And so I want to read this quote here, sort of summarizing this. He says, in sum, a coming Messiah, resurrection, and monotheism were all concepts known in the ancient Jewish and Greco-Roman world. Everybody knew about those. Yet no one mutated or changed them and put them together the way that early Christians did concerning Jesus. They uniquely, with unparalleled innovation, proclaimed that the crucified man Jesus was the Messiah whom God raised from the dead and was also Lord of the world. This disgraced, publicly executed criminal They said God bodily raised from the dead, and he is not only the ruler of the world, he is God himself. What? And that's what they claimed. And this fits with what we're saying fits with what their expectations were. So, number one, what did the disciples seem to expect in the Messiah? So, for instance, in Luke 24, 18 through 21, what is that referring to? What's going on there? Do we remember? The road to Emmaus. And what do those men say to Jesus before they realize who he is? We thought he was going to be the one to redeem Israel. But what happened? He died. And so that meant God's kingdom was not coming and that he was not the Messiah because he died. And then what do we see in Acts chapter 1 and verse 6? What's happening there? He's with the apostles, and the apostles say, Are you gonna do it now? You know, you died and you came back to life, and that's cool and everything. Or are you gonna enact the plan now and redeem Israel? It just was not computing in their worldview, and that's what we're saying. We cannot explain where this came from based on any ideas that existed at the time. And that's a huge thing, that this was completely unique and different from anything that had ever occurred before. Okay. So, we partook in some extended discussion, which is great. So we'll try to wrap this up relatively quickly on Wednesday. And then whatever time we have left, we will start fact number 4, which is on the back table. Does anyone have anything they want to say before we close?
Thanks for being patient.
Oh, yeah. All right, thanks.